At his wife's funeral, a Navy SEAL learned his dog had guarded her secret $1 million cabin for years. After burying his wife beneath the frozen pines of Montana, former Navy SEAL Ethan Mercer thought his life was finally over. But hours later, a brass key, a hidden map, and one strange message changed everything. Ghost already knows where to go. Deep inside the Bitterroot Mountains, Ethan follows his loyal German shepherd to a flower-covered cabin hiding a secret powerful men would kill to own. Comment 1 if you'd protect the sanctuary, or 0 if you'd take the millions, and tell us where you're watching from. The mountains surrounding Alder Ridge looked carved from iron and ice. Snow drifted silently through the tall pines overlooking the cemetery, settling across gravestones already buried beneath the early Montana winter. The sky hung low and gray above the valley, heavy with the promise of another storm before nightfall. Somewhere beyond the ridges, the Bitterroot River moved beneath sheets of frozen slush, carrying its dark water through the sleeping wilderness. Ethan Mercer stood motionless beside the grave. At 46 years old, he still carried the posture of a Navy SEAL. Broad shoulders, strong hands, the rigid stillness of a man trained to hold himself together no matter what was collapsing around him. Years of combat had hardened the lines of his face, but grief had hollowed him in ways war never could. A rough beard shadowed his jaw, streaked faintly with gray, and deep exhaustion sat permanently beneath his pale blue eyes. The coffin below him had already disappeared beneath layers of snow and flowers. Claire was gone. The words still refused to become real inside his mind. The small mountain cemetery had mostly emptied now. The handful of townspeople who attended the funeral had quietly returned to their trucks and homes before the weather worsened. Only the priest remained near the chapel steps, speaking softly with the groundskeeper, while cold wind swept across the hillside. Ghost stood beside Ethan in complete silence. The German shepherd's thick black and tan coat stirred in the wind as he watched the tree line surrounding the cemetery. His ears remained alert, shifting constantly toward distant sounds only he could hear. He had once been a military combat dog, attached to Ethan's SEAL unit overseas. Years earlier, Ghost had detected explosives before entire convoys rolled into death traps. He had dragged wounded soldiers from collapsed buildings under gunfire. He had saved Ethan's life twice. Now the old dog stood beside another battlefield neither of them knew how to survive. Ghost whined softly. Not loud, just enough to pull Ethan from the numb fog inside his head. Ethan rested one gloved hand against the dog's neck. Ghost immediately leaned into the touch, but kept scanning the cemetery, restless in a way Ethan had never seen before. "You feel it too, huh?" Ethan murmured quietly. His voice sounded strange after hours of silence. Ghost glanced up at him briefly before looking back toward the mountains. The wind shifted harder. A memory struck Ethan without warning. Claire standing on the porch last spring, wrapped in a thick wool sweater, laughing softly while Ghost chased snowflakes through the yard like a puppy. The way sunlight caught the copper strands in her dark hair. The way she always watched Ethan carefully when she thought he wasn't looking, as if she was constantly measuring how much pain he carried that day. Ethan swallowed hard. For years, Claire had tried to pull him back from the places war left inside him. The nightmares, the silence, the sudden flashes of rage he never aimed at her but still poisoned the house one room at a time. She had fought for their marriage long after he stopped knowing how. And now she was gone. A cold ache settled deeper into his chest. Not sharp, not explosive. Just heavy enough to crush everything beneath it. Footsteps approached slowly through the snow behind him. "Mr. Mercer?" Ethan turned slightly. An elderly man stood several feet away near the cemetery gate. He wore a long charcoal overcoat dusted with snow and held a leather satchel beneath one arm. His narrow shoulders stooped slightly beneath the cold, but his eyes remained steady and sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. Walter Grayson, Claire's attorney. Ethan recognized him from the hospital during Claire's final weeks. Walter removed his gloves carefully. "I apologize for bothering you today," he said gently. "But Claire asked me to give you something personally. She was very specific about that." Ethan stared at him for a moment before nodding once. Walter stepped forward and opened the satchel. From inside, he removed 3 items: an old brass key, a folded paper map worn soft at the edges, and a sealed envelope with Ethan's name written across the front in Claire's handwriting. The sight of her handwriting nearly shattered something inside him. Walter handed the items over carefully. "She wanted you to have these immediately after the funeral," he explained quietly. "She said you would understand when the time came." Ethan turned the envelope over in his hands. The paper trembled slightly beneath his gloves. Ghost suddenly moved closer beside him, staring intensely at the map. Walter noticed the dog immediately. A strange expression crossed the old lawyer's face. "She also told me something else," Walter said. Ethan looked up. Walter hesitated briefly before speaking. "She said," he glanced toward Ghost, "she said the dog already knows where to go." Silence swallowed the cemetery. Even the wind seemed to pause. Ethan frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" Walter shook his head slowly. "I'm afraid she never explained." Ghost stepped forward suddenly and nudged the folded map with his nose. Once, firmly. Ethan looked down at the dog. Ghost's posture had completely changed now. His ears stood high, his muscles tightened beneath his coat. The same alert focus Ethan remembered from combat patrols had returned to the old shepherd's body, as if some buried instinct had suddenly awakened. Walter quietly cleared his throat. "There's one more thing." He reached into his coat pocket and handed Ethan a small photograph. Claire stood smiling beside a wooden cabin covered in climbing flowers somewhere deep in the mountains. Snow capped the roof behind her, while late summer sunlight spilled across a valley of wildflowers surrounding the property. Ghost appeared beside her in the photo. Younger, healthier, but unmistakably there. Ethan stared at the picture. His pulse slowed. Claire had never shown him this place. Not once. Walter lowered his voice. "I think she was trying to protect something," he said carefully. "From who?" Ethan asked. The old lawyer looked toward the distant mountains. "I don't know." Ghost suddenly let out a low growl. Not aggressive. Warning. Ethan immediately turned toward the tree line beyond the cemetery road. Nothing moved between the pines. But years of military instinct tightened inside his chest anyway. Someone had been watching. The feeling vanished almost as quickly as it came. Walter glanced nervously toward the darkening sky. "I should go before the roads freeze over." Ethan nodded absently. The old man paused before leaving. "Claire loved you very much, Ethan," he said quietly, "even during the years when you couldn't love yourself." Then he walked away through the snow. Ethan remained beside the grave long after the cemetery emptied completely. Twilight slowly settled over Alder Ridge. The mountains darkened into enormous shadows beyond town, while freezing wind swept through the pines overhead. Snow continued falling in soft waves across the cemetery until Claire's grave almost disappeared beneath white silence. Ghost never stopped watching the forest. Hours later, Ethan finally returned home. The small house at the edge of town felt colder without Claire inside it. Everything remained exactly where she left it. A half-finished puzzle on the dining room table. Her reading glasses beside the couch. A mug still sitting near the kitchen sink. Ghost paced restlessly through every room while Ethan stood in the darkness near the fireplace holding Claire's envelope unopened in his hand. He couldn't bring himself to read it yet. Outside, snow hammered harder against the windows. The storm had arrived. Ghost suddenly rushed toward the front door. Then the scratching started. Violent, urgent. The shepherd clawed against the wood hard enough to rattle the frame. "Ghost!" Ethan snapped instinctively. The dog ignored him completely. He barked once, sharp, commanding, then scratched at the door again. Ethan stared at him in confusion. Ghost never behaved like this inside the house. Never. The old shepherd turned and ran toward the garage entrance before looking back at Ethan again. Waiting. Demanding. Ethan slowly frowned. "What the hell's gotten into you?" Ghost barked again and slammed one paw against the garage door. Then Ethan understood. The truck, the mountains, the map. Something cold slid through Ethan's chest. Ghost wasn't panicking. He was trying to take him somewhere. Ethan looked down at Claire's unopened letter in his hand. Outside, the storm howled louder through the frozen Montana darkness. For several long seconds, Ethan stood completely still. Then Ghost scratched at the garage door one final time. And Ethan finally moved. Toward the mountains. Toward whatever Claire had hidden there. Toward the place Ghost already knew. Snow exploded beneath Ethan Mercer's tires as the truck climbed out of Alder Ridge and into the northern mountains. The storm had thickened into a white curtain, swallowing the narrow highway 1 mile at a time. Pine trees leaned heavily over the road, their branches burdened with snow that occasionally cracked loose and crashed into the darkness beside him. Ghost sat rigid in the passenger seat, not restless anymore. Focused. The old German shepherd stared through the windshield with the same deadly concentration he used to wear overseas during convoy patrols. His ears twitched toward every turn before they reached it, his body subtly shifting seconds before Ethan adjusted the wheel. It unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. The heater hummed softly inside the truck cab, but cold still lingered beneath Ethan's skin. He drove with one hand, while Claire's folded map rested open across the passenger seat between him and Ghost. The paper was old, hand-drawn. Several roads had been crossed out entirely in red ink. Others circled through the Bitterroot Mountains like veins cutting across the wilderness. Near the upper corner, Claire had written a single sentence in small, careful handwriting. "Follow the river until the trees open." Ethan swallowed hard every time he looked at the words. It still felt impossible seeing her handwriting after lowering her coffin into frozen earth only hours earlier. Outside, the storm worsened. The highway narrowed into a cracked mountain road that wound through steep ridges overlooking black cliffs and frozen ravines. Ethan hadn't driven this far north in years. Most of the old logging routes had been abandoned after the mills shut down decades earlier. Nobody lived out here anymore. At least nobody was supposed to. Ghost suddenly let out a low sound in his throat. Not a growl. A signal. Ethan slowed slightly. Ahead, nearly hidden beneath blowing snow, an old Forest Service road disappeared into the trees on the right side of the mountain. No sign. No lights. Just darkness. Ghost immediately pushed his nose toward the windshield. "You're kidding me," Ethan muttered quietly. The road looked barely wide enough for the truck, but Ghost remained locked onto it. Ethan glanced once more at the map. Claire's red line turned sharply north at this exact point. A strange pressure settled inside his chest. He turned the wheel. The truck bounced violently as they left the pavement behind. Snow and mud sprayed beneath the tires while dead branches scraped along the sides of the vehicle. The forest swallowed them almost instantly. Towering pines crowded both sides of the narrow road like walls. The deeper they drove, the quieter the world became. No passing cars, no distant lights, nothing except wind and snow moving through ancient trees. Ghost relaxed slightly. Not calm. Certain. Ethan noticed it immediately. "You've been here before," he said softly. Ghost didn't look at him. but his tail moved once against the seat. The answer tightened Ethan's grip on the steering wheel. For years, Claire had told him she spent weekends volunteering at clinics in nearby towns. Sometimes she disappeared for 2 or 3 days at a time while Ethan buried himself in silence and whiskey and memories he refused to talk about. And all along, she had been coming here, with Ghost. The realization hurt worse than anger. Not betrayal. Something heavier. Regret. The road twisted deeper into the mountains for nearly another hour. Several times Ethan nearly lost control on patches of ice hidden beneath fresh snow. The truck fishtailed dangerously along narrow ledges overlooking dark ravines, before Ghost's low warning sounds helped Ethan slow moments before disaster. The dog knew these roads, every curve, every turn, every danger. Eventually the forest began thinning. Ghost suddenly stood. Ethan frowned. "What is it?" Then he saw it. Far ahead through the storm, faint shapes emerged beyond the trees. A valley, hidden between 2 towering ridges. The snowfall eased slightly as they descended toward it, revealing long stretches of open ground covered beneath frozen wildflowers and snow-covered brush. The valley itself looked untouched by time. Massive pine forests surrounded it on all sides, while a narrow river cut through the center like black glass beneath the moonlight. And near the far side of the valley stood the cabin. Ethan slowly removed his foot from the gas pedal. The structure sat partially hidden among clusters of climbing vines and skeletal flower trellises, now buried beneath winter frost. Several collapsed greenhouse frames surrounded the property like broken ribs jutting from the snow. Warm yellow light glowed faintly through one window. Ethan's pulse slowed. Someone was here. Ghost barked once, sharp, excited. Then before Ethan could stop him, the shepherd pushed against the truck door hard enough for it to swing open. "Ghost!" The dog leaped into the snow and sprinted across the valley, not cautiously, not searching, running home. Ethan climbed out immediately, boots sinking deep into snow as freezing wind tore across the open valley. Ghost reached the cabin porch within seconds and bounded up the wooden steps, then suddenly stopped. The old shepherd lowered himself beside the front door and rested there quietly, like he had finally arrived somewhere he belonged. Ethan stared at him from across the valley. Snow drifted gently around the cabin, while weak porch lights flickered against the storm-dark mountains behind it. Thick dead vines wrapped around the walls and windows, their frozen branches hanging like sleeping veins across old timber. Even from a distance, the place felt alive, not abandoned. Waiting. Ethan slowly approached through the snow. Every step tightened the strange ache growing inside his chest. The closer he got, the more details emerged from the darkness. Flower boxes beneath the windows, wind chimes made from old silverware, a stack of chopped firewood beside the porch covered carefully beneath canvas. Someone had maintained this place. Recently. Ghost remained lying beside the front door, watching Ethan approach with calm, patient eyes. "You really know this place," Ethan whispered. Ghost's ears lifted slightly. The front porch creaked beneath Ethan's boots as he climbed the steps. Up close, the cabin smelled faintly of cedar smoke and dried flowers buried beneath cold mountain air. Ethan reached for the brass key inside his jacket pocket. His hand hesitated. For one strange moment, it felt like opening this door would permanently divide his life into before and after. The storm howled softly through the valley behind him. Ghost stood slowly beside the door, waiting. Ethan inserted the key. The old lock clicked immediately. No resistance, as if Claire had expected him at any moment. He pushed the door open slowly. Warm air drifted outward, not warm from electricity, from fire. A wood stove crackled softly somewhere inside the cabin, filling the darkness with flickering amber light. Ethan froze. Someone was definitely here. Ghost stepped past him first. The shepherd moved through the doorway confidently, but without aggression, his paws crossing the wooden floorboards with familiar ease. He disappeared briefly into the shadows beyond the main room, before reappearing seconds later, completely relaxed. No threat. Ethan entered cautiously. The cabin interior stole the breath from his lungs. Dried flowers hung from wooden ceiling beams in carefully arranged bundles. Shelves lined every wall, filled with glass jars containing herbs, roots, seeds, and handwritten labels. Old lanterns cast soft golden light across worn furniture covered in blankets Claire had clearly sewn herself. The place smelled exactly like her. Lavender, tea leaves, the faint earthy scent that always clung to her sweaters after weekends away. Ethan slowly turned in place. His chest tightened harder with every detail. A blue ceramic mug sat beside the fireplace. Claire's favorite mug, a knitted blanket draped over a nearby rocking chair, one he remembered her finishing last winter while Ghost slept beside her feet. The cabin wasn't just a hidden place. It was another life. Ghost padded quietly toward a narrow hallway before stopping beside a wall covered in photographs. Ethan followed. His pulse began hammering the closer he got. Dozens of photographs covered the wall from floor to ceiling. Veterans, men and women of different ages, standing beside Claire outside the cabin during different seasons. Some smiled. Others looked exhausted, broken, recovering. And in nearly every photograph, Ghost appeared beside them. Ethan stepped closer slowly. One photo showed Claire kneeling beside a young Marine missing part of his leg, while Ghost rested against the man's wheelchair. Another showed several veterans planting flowers outside the greenhouse during summer sunlight. Then Ethan saw the oldest photograph. Claire stood beside the cabin porch, smiling directly at the camera, and beside her sat Ghost. Several years younger, healthy, alert, at home. Ethan stared at the image in silence. The dog had known this place for years, long before tonight, long before Claire died. Ghost walked quietly back toward Ethan and sat beside him beneath the photographs. The old shepherd looked up once, almost gently, as if waiting for Ethan to finally understand something. Outside, snow continued falling across the hidden valley, and somewhere deep beneath the grief crushing his chest, another feeling slowly began rising. Not anger, not fear. Questions. Questions Claire had carried into the grave. Questions waiting somewhere inside this mountain sanctuary, hidden beneath snow and flowers. And for the first time since the funeral, Ethan realized Claire's death had not ended something. It had opened a door. The storm deepened outside the cabin walls. Snow drifted heavily through the hidden valley, while wind swept across the frozen flower fields surrounding the property. Beyond the windows, the Bitterroot Mountains disappeared into darkness beneath rolling clouds, isolating the cabin from the rest of the world. Inside, warmth flickered softly through the small wooden rooms. Ghost moved carefully through the cabin, as if checking each corner one final time before finally settling near the fireplace. The old shepherd lowered himself onto the braided rug beside the stove, though his ears still twitched toward every sound outside. Ethan stood motionless in the center of the room. Every object around him felt impossibly intimate. Claire's fingerprints still seemed pressed into the life she had built here. A stack of folded flannel blankets rested beside the couch. Handwritten labels marked dozens of glass jars lining the shelves. Dried lavender hung upside down from ceiling beams alongside bundles of sage and mountain herbs Ethan couldn't name. The cabin smelled like memory, like the version of Claire he hadn't truly seen in years. Slowly, Ethan removed his coat and gloves, placing them over the back of a wooden chair near the fire. Exhaustion settled into his bones now that the adrenaline from the drive had faded. But beneath the exhaustion was something sharper. questions. He walked toward the long wooden table near the kitchen area. Papers covered nearly every inch of its surface. Medical textbooks, botanical sketches, research notes written entirely in Claire's careful handwriting. Ethan picked up one loose page. The title at the top read, Natural Nerve Regeneration Trials, Bitterroot Strain. His brow furrowed. Below the title, rows of detailed notes filled the page. Dosages, sleep patterns, pain responses, emotional stability markers. The language sounded almost clinical, nothing like a hobby. Ethan turned another page, and another. His pulse slowed the more he read. Claire hadn't simply been growing flowers out here. She had been researching medicine. Ghost suddenly stood. The shepherd crossed the room slowly before stopping near the kitchen table. He lowered his head toward the floorboards, sniffing carefully along the edges beneath the rug. Then he pawed once against the wood. Ethan looked up. What is it? Ghost pawed again, more insistently this time. The same behavior he used to display overseas when locating buried explosives or hidden weapons caches. Ethan immediately crossed the room. Years of instinct took over before grief could cloud his thinking. He crouched beside Ghost and pulled back the braided rug covering the floor. The wood beneath it looked ordinary at first glance, until Ethan noticed faint scratches near the seams, a hidden compartment. His chest tightened. Ghost stepped back slightly while Ethan pressed his fingers against the edge of one floorboard. The panel lifted almost immediately. Cold air drifted upward from the darkness below. Inside sat several waterproof containers stacked neatly beneath the floor. Ethan stared down at them silently. Claire had hidden this carefully. He reached inside and lifted out the first container. Heavy. Military-grade storage. Ghost watched him closely as Ethan opened the latches. Inside were dozens of organized file folders, photographs, medical charts, voice recorders, and military records. Ethan slowly removed the first folder. The name printed across the tab read, Sergeant Daniel Reeves, USMC. Below it, chronic PTSD, severe nerve damage, sleep instability. Ethan opened the file carefully. Inside were months of treatment notes written by Claire herself. Observed reduction in panic episodes after prolonged exposure to valley environment. Improved sleep following herbal compound administration. Subject responding positively to canine interaction therapy with Ghost. Ethan froze. His eyes moved slowly back to the last sentence. Ghost had been part of this. The old shepherd remained perfectly still beside him, as if waiting for Ethan to catch up to a truth the dog already understood. Ethan opened another folder, then another. Every file belonged to a veteran. Army Rangers, Marines, Air Force pararescue, men and women carrying invisible damage home from war. And Claire had been helping them here, quietly, secretly, for years. Outside, wind rattled the cabin windows hard enough to shake the walls. Ghost suddenly lifted his head toward the hallway. Ethan noticed the shift immediately. What is it? The shepherd walked away from the kitchen slowly, disappearing down the narrow hallway leading deeper into the cabin. Ethan grabbed a lantern from the table and followed him. The hallway walls were lined with more photographs, dozens of them. Veterans smiling beside Claire outside the cabin during summer harvests and snowy winters alike. Some held fishing poles beside the river. Others planted flowers near the greenhouse frames. Many looked broken in the earlier photographs, and lighter in the later ones. Hopeful, alive again. Ethan stopped walking. His throat tightened painfully. Claire had built an entire world out here without him ever knowing. Ghost paused beside the final room at the end of the hallway. The bedroom. Ethan pushed the door open slowly. The room was simple but warm. A small bed sat beneath a window overlooking the valley. Bookshelves filled one wall entirely, stacked with journals and binders. A lantern still rested on the bedside table beside a pair of Claire's reading glasses, like she had only stepped outside moments ago. Ethan moved slowly through the room. Then his eyes landed on the photographs above the desk. His breath caught. Claire. Ghost. Together. Over and over again. One photograph showed Claire kneeling beside Ghost near the greenhouse during summer sunlight, while the shepherd carried gardening gloves in his mouth. Another showed Ghost resting behind a wounded veteran sitting near the riverbank. And then Ethan saw the oldest picture, Claire standing beside the cabin porch years earlier, before her illness, before the distance between them had fully grown. Ghost sat beside her while snow fell gently around the valley. Written across the bottom in Claire's handwriting were 4 simple words. He always brings them home. Ethan stared at the photograph in silence. A cold realization slowly unfolded inside him. Ghost hadn't simply known about the cabin. He had worked here, helped her here, protected this place. The shepherd walked quietly to the side of the bed and lay down, comfortable, familiar, at home. Ethan lowered himself slowly into the chair beside Claire's desk. His eyes drifted across the journals stacked carefully beside the lantern. One notebook sat alone at the very top. Unlike the others, its leather cover looked worn from years of use. Ethan opened it carefully. The first page nearly shattered him. If you're reading this, Ethan, then Ghost finally brought you here. His vision blurred immediately. He swallowed hard and continued reading. I know you probably feel angry right now, or confused, maybe both. I wanted to tell you about this place 100 times, but every time I looked at you, I saw how tired you already were. You carried so much pain home from the war that I started building this sanctuary because I didn't know how else to reach you anymore. Ethan's hands trembled slightly. The fire crackled softly somewhere down the hallway, while snow hammered against the windows outside. I watched you disappear piece by piece over the years, not because you stopped loving me, because you stopped believing you deserved peace. Tears burned behind Ethan's eyes. He kept reading. Ghost noticed before anyone else did. Every nightmare, every panic attack, every time you drifted too close to giving up. That dog never stopped watching over you. Neither did I. A soft sound pulled Ethan from the page. Ghost had crossed the room silently. The old shepherd rested his head against Ethan's knee. Ethan looked down at him. For a long moment neither moved. Then something inside Ethan finally cracked. Not violently, not dramatically, just enough for grief to finally breathe. He bent forward slowly and buried one trembling hand deep into Ghost's fur. The old dog remained perfectly still beside him. Outside, snow buried the hidden valley deeper beneath darkness and silence. But inside the cabin, surrounded by flowers Claire had planted and lives she had quietly helped heal, Ethan finally understood something that terrified him even more than losing her. Claire had spent years trying to save him, and he had never even noticed. The realization sat inside Ethan Mercer like a wound reopening beneath scar tissue. Outside the cabin windows, dawn slowly crept into the Bitterroot Valley. Snowfall had finally weakened during the night, leaving the mountains wrapped beneath pale blue light and drifting fog. The frozen flower fields surrounding the cabin stretched across the valley like sleeping ghosts beneath the snow. Ethan had not slept. He sat alone beside the fireplace with Claire's journal open across his lap, while Ghost rested nearby on the rug. The old shepherd slept lightly, ears twitching at every shift of wind outside the cabin walls. The fire crackled softly. Warmth filled the room. But inside Ethan, old, cold places still lingered. He stared down at another page of Claire's handwriting. Today, Marcus smiled for the first time in months. Ghost sat beside him nearly the entire afternoon while we worked near the greenhouse. Sometimes I think wounded soldiers trust dogs long before they trust people again. Ethan turned the page slowly. Another veteran. Another story. Claire had filled entire journals with them. Names, progress notes, quiet observations about broken men and women trying to rebuild themselves inside this hidden valley. Former combat medics, Marines, National Guard soldiers. One Army Ranger suffering from severe panic attacks after losing his team overseas. A Navy corpsman addicted to painkillers after surgery. Claire had written about them all with deep patience and heartbreaking tenderness. Never judgment, never pity. Only hope. Ethan leaned back heavily against the chair. For years he had believed Claire spent weekends escaping him. Maybe she had, but not because she stopped loving him, because she was trying to build something strong enough to reach him. Ghost suddenly lifted his head. A low sound rolled through the dog's throat. Alert. Ethan immediately looked toward the front windows. Movement. A vehicle slowly emerged through the snowy valley below the cabin. An old green pickup truck crawled carefully along the frozen dirt road leading toward the property. Snow sprayed behind the tires as it climbed toward the cabin through the morning fog. Ghost stood immediately. Not aggressive. Watchful. Ethan rose from the chair and crossed toward the front door. Years of military instinct returned automatically, his body tightening before his mind fully caught up. Nobody should have known he was here. The pickup finally stopped near the greenhouse ruins several yards from the cabin. The driver's door opened. A woman stepped out into the snow. She appeared to be somewhere in her early 50s, dressed in a thick brown winter coat with dark jeans and worn leather boots. Auburn hair streaked with gray spilled from beneath a knitted cap, while cold wind tugged at the scarf wrapped around her neck. She paused the moment she saw Ethan standing on the porch. Then her eyes drifted toward Ghost. Something softened in her expression immediately. "Well," she said quietly, "you actually brought him back here." Ethan frowned slightly. The woman climbed the porch steps slowly, careful on the ice. Ghost remained beside Ethan but did not growl. That alone told Ethan something important. The dog knew her. "I'm Dr. Leah Bennett," the woman said gently. "Claire's friend." Ethan stared at her silently for a moment before stepping aside. Leah entered the cabin carefully, removing snow-covered gloves while she looked around the room. Her eyes lingered briefly on Claire's journals spread across the table. Then she looked back at Ethan. "I heard about the funeral yesterday," she said softly. "I came this morning as soon as the roads cleared enough to drive." Ethan crossed his arms. "You knew about this place?" "Yes." "How long?" Leah hesitated. "Almost 8 years." The number hit Ethan harder than expected. Ghost quietly approached Leah and nudged her hand once with his nose. She smiled faintly and scratched behind the shepherd's ears. "There's my old guardian," she whispered. Ghost's tail moved once. Ethan watched the interaction carefully. "You were part of this too," he said. Leah looked toward the greenhouse ruins visible through the frosted windows. "Claire started everything herself," she replied. "I only helped when the medical side became too complicated." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "Medical side." Leah nodded toward the journals. "She was brilliant, Ethan." The words carried no exaggeration, only certainty. Leah slowly removed her coat and moved toward the kitchen table. She carefully picked up one of Claire's notebooks and opened it. She believed trauma changed the body long before doctors understood how, Leah explained. Not just emotionally, physically, nerve damage, sleep disorders, chronic inflammation, hypervigilance. Her eyes lifted toward Ethan. The kind of things you've lived with for years. Ethan looked away. The cabin suddenly felt smaller. Leah continued quietly. Claire spent years studying natural compounds that could help veterans without turning them into addicts. She never told me any of this. No, Leah agreed softly. She didn't. Anger flickered briefly through Ethan's chest. Not explosive. Wounded. Why? Leah was silent for a long moment before answering. Because every time she tried to help you directly, she said carefully, you pushed her away. The truth landed hard. Ghost shifted quietly beside Ethan, but did not move closer. Leah's voice softened further. She understood your pain better than you realized, Ethan, but she also understood something else. Leah glanced toward the journals. You couldn't be forced into healing. You had to choose it yourself. Silence filled the cabin. Wind rattled softly against the windows. Ethan stared into the fire while old memories surfaced one after another. Claire asking him to come hiking with her. Claire trying to convince him to attend group counseling. Claire quietly sitting beside him during sleepless nights while he drowned himself in whiskey and silence. And every time, he shut the door. Leah carefully closed the journal in her hands. She never stopped trying, she said. Ghost slowly crossed the room, then rested beside Ethan's chair. The old shepherd leaned gently against Ethan's leg, grounding him. Leah noticed. That dog saved more people out here than you know, she said quietly. Ethan frowned slightly. How? Sometimes veterans arrived here completely shattered. Leah's eyes drifted toward Ghost. Ghost always knew which ones needed comfort and which ones needed space. Claire used to joke he understood pain better than doctors did. A faint smile almost touched Ethan's face before disappearing again. Leah reached into her bag and removed several photographs. She laid them carefully across the table. Ethan stepped closer. The first showed a young veteran standing beside the greenhouse during summer. The second showed the same man months later smiling beside Claire while planting flowers. Then Ethan noticed Ghost in every image, always nearby, always watching. He stayed with people during panic attacks, Leah explained softly. Nightmares too. Some veterans trusted Ghost before they trusted anyone else. Ethan picked up another photograph. A heavily scarred Marine sat beside the riverbank, while Ghost rested his head against the man's chest. Written across the bottom, first peaceful sleep in 11 months. Ethan swallowed hard. Leah's voice lowered carefully. Claire believed healing started with safety. That's what this place was built for. Outside, weak sunlight finally broke through the storm clouds, spilling pale gold across the snow-covered valley. The cabin brightened softly. Ghost suddenly stood and moved toward the back door. He barked once, short, focused. Leah looked toward him immediately. He wants to show you something. Ethan frowned. Show me what? Ghost barked again and scratched lightly at the door. Leah smiled sadly. He used to do that with Claire whenever she worked in the greenhouse. Ethan hesitated briefly before grabbing his coat. The cold struck immediately as they stepped outside. Fresh snow crunched beneath their boots while icy wind swept through the valley, carrying the faint scent of pine and frozen earth. The collapsed greenhouse structures stood beyond the cabin like skeletons buried beneath winter. Ghost moved ahead confidently through the snow. Ethan and Leah followed. The shepherd stopped near the largest greenhouse frame partially hidden beneath dead vines and ice-covered glass panels. He sniffed carefully along the edge before pawing at a drift of snow near the entrance. Ethan knelt beside him. Beneath the snow sat a wooden sign almost completely buried by winter. He brushed it clean slowly. The carved words hit him like a punch to the chest. Mercer Sanctuary. Built for those still fighting battles nobody else can see. Ethan stared silently at the sign. His last name. Claire had named this place after him. Leah stepped quietly beside him. She always believed you'd come here eventually, she said. The mountains stood silent around them. Far above the valley, sunlight spilled across endless snow-covered ridges, while cold wind carried through the trees like distant whispers. Ghost sat beside the sign, calmly watching Ethan, waiting. As if the old shepherd had spent years guarding not just a cabin, but a future Claire believed Ethan still deserved to find. The wind moved softly through the frozen valley. Snow drifted from the pine branches above, while weak sunlight spread across the flower fields buried beneath winter. Ethan stood motionless beside the wooden Mercer Sanctuary sign, staring down at the carved letters while Ghost sat quietly at his side. For years, Ethan had believed his life was slowly ending. Claire, somehow, had spent those same years building him another one. The realization left him hollow in ways grief alone never could. Leah rested one gloved hand against the edge of the greenhouse frame beside them. She wanted this place to survive after her, she said quietly. Ethan looked toward the cabin. You talk like she knew she was dying long before anyone told me. Leah's expression tightened slightly. She did. The answer landed hard. Ethan's jaw flexed beneath the cold air. How long? Leah hesitated before speaking. Almost 2 years. The mountains suddenly felt very quiet. Ghost glanced up at Ethan immediately, sensing the tension changing inside him. She asked me not to tell you, Leah continued carefully. By the time they confirmed the diagnosis, the cancer had already spread too far. Ethan turned away sharply, staring toward the distant river cutting through the valley below. 2 years. 2 years Claire carried that alone while he drowned himself in nightmares and silence. A pulse of anger moved through him. Not toward Claire. Toward himself. Leah lowered her voice. She spent most of her final year preparing this place, expanding the greenhouses, organizing research, making legal arrangements. Why not just tell me? She tried. Leah paused. You stopped listening long before she stopped talking. The truth cut deeper because it was accurate. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. He remembered the fights now. Claire asking him to leave the house more often. Claire begging him to speak to someone. Claire trying to convince him there was still life beyond surviving one day at a time. And every time, he shut down. Ghost pressed gently against Ethan's leg, grounding him before the spiral inside his chest deepened further. Ethan rested one hand against the shepherd's neck. The old dog remained perfectly still beside him. Leah suddenly looked toward the far end of the valley road. Her expression shifted immediately. Ethan noticed. What is it? Leah didn't answer right away. Instead, she squinted toward the trees beyond the lower ridge. A sound drifted faintly through the valley. Engines. Multiple. Ghost heard them a second later. The shepherd's posture changed instantly. His ears lifted high while a low growl rolled quietly through his chest. Ethan turned toward the road. 2 black SUVs emerged slowly from the forest below. Large, expensive, wildly out of place in the middle of the Montana wilderness. Snow sprayed beneath their tires as they climbed toward the cabin. Leah muttered something under her breath Ethan couldn't hear. You know them? I was afraid this might happen sooner. Ghost stepped slightly in front of Ethan now, protective, focused. The vehicles finally stopped near the cabin porch. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then the passenger door of the lead SUV opened. A tall man stepped out carefully into the snow. mid-50s, expensive charcoal coat, silver watch gleaming beneath his sleeve. His dark hair remained perfectly styled despite the mountain wind. Everything about him felt polished, controlled, predatory. Another man exited behind him carrying a leather briefcase while a broad-shouldered security driver remained near the vehicles scanning the valley. The tall man smiled faintly as he approached. Not warm, practiced. "Mr. Mercer," he said smoothly, "I'm Damien Cross." Ethan said nothing. Damien's eyes briefly moved toward Ghost. The shepherd's growl deepened. "Interesting," Damien thought silently. "You've already met my reputation, then," he said calmly. Leah crossed her arms. "You shouldn't be here." Damien barely acknowledged her. "Dr. Bennett." The way he said her name carried old tension beneath the politeness. Ethan stepped slightly forward. "What do you want?" Damien looked toward the cabin, then the greenhouse ruins, then the valley itself. His smile faded into something more serious. "Your wife built something remarkable here." The words immediately tightened Ethan's chest. Damien continued carefully. "Claire and I spoke several times over the past year." Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. "She never mentioned you." "I imagine she didn't trust me enough." At least he was honest about that. Ghost suddenly barked once. Sharp, warning. Damien glanced at the dog again, but continued speaking. "Your wife's botanical research has enormous commercial potential," he explained. "Several compounds she developed here show extremely promising early results in chronic pain management and neurological stabilization." Leah's face hardened. "You mean painkillers?" "No," Damien corrected smoothly. "Alternatives to painkillers." He reached into his coat and removed a folded document. "My company specializes in pharmaceutical acquisition and development," he continued. "We're prepared to purchase the property, research rights, and all related materials for a substantial amount." Ethan didn't move. "How substantial?" Damien held his gaze evenly. $7 million. The number hung heavily in the frozen air. Even Leah looked surprised. Snow drifted quietly between them. Ghost remained completely rigid beside Ethan. 7 million. Enough money to erase every debt Ethan had. Enough to disappear somewhere far from Montana. Enough to never think about war or grief or this valley again. Damien stepped closer carefully. "Claire refused every offer while she was alive," he said, "but circumstances have changed." Leah scoffed sharply. "You mean she died?" Damien ignored her. "We can preserve her research properly," he continued toward Ethan. "Clinical testing, production facilities, distribution." He glanced toward the greenhouse ruins. "This place isn't equipped to handle what her discoveries could become." Ethan stared at the snow beneath his boots. Part of him wanted to say yes immediately, to walk away from all of it. The memories, the guilt, the unbearable realization of how badly he failed Claire while she tried to save him. But another part of him kept remembering her journals, the photographs, the veterans, Ghost helping broken strangers beside the riverbank. This place had never been about money. Damien studied Ethan's silence carefully. "There are others interested besides us," he added quietly. "Less patient people." Leah stepped forward. "That sounds like a threat." "It's reality." Ghost suddenly moved, fast. The shepherd stepped directly between Damien and the greenhouse path, teeth barely visible now beneath curled lips. His growl vibrated low and dangerous through the valley. The security driver instinctively moved one hand toward his jacket. Ethan's voice turned cold immediately. "Don't." The driver froze. Ghost never took his eyes off Damien. Damien slowly raised both hands slightly. "Easy." But Ethan noticed something important. For the first time since arriving, Damien looked unsettled. Not by Ethan, by the dog. "You should leave," Ethan said quietly. Damien studied him carefully for several seconds, then slowly nodded. "This offer won't remain open forever." Ethan said nothing. Damien handed the folded document to Leah instead. "Think carefully before protecting something you can't control," he said softly. Then he turned and walked back toward the SUVs. The valley fell silent again, except for crunching snow beneath their boots. Ghost remained standing guard until both vehicles disappeared back down the mountain road. Only then did the shepherd relax slightly. Leah exhaled slowly beside Ethan. "He's been after Claire's research for months." Ethan looked toward her sharply. "Why?" "Because some of her compounds actually work." The words lingered heavily between them. Leah looked toward the cabin windows, glowing softly in the late afternoon light. She refused to sell because she was terrified companies like his would bury the humanitarian side of everything she built here. Leah glanced toward Ethan. "To people like Damien Cross, wounded veterans are a market." Ethan's jaw tightened. Ghost remained staring toward the tree line long after the SUVs vanished. Watching. Listening. The old shepherd's instincts still hadn't settled completely. Night arrived quickly in the mountains. Clouds swallowed the last sunlight, while freezing wind swept through the valley, hard enough to rattle the greenhouse frames. Ethan spent the evening repairing storm shutters alongside Leah, while Ghost patrolled constantly between the cabin and tree line. The shepherd grew more restless after dark. Twice Ethan caught him staring toward the forest beyond the river. Once he barked suddenly into the darkness before falling silent again. Leah noticed too. "He senses something," she whispered. Ethan nodded. Military instincts pressed uneasily inside his chest now. The feeling of being watched. He knew it too well. Near midnight, snow began falling again. Thick. Heavy. The cabin fire burned low, while Leah slept briefly on the couch beneath one of Claire's blankets. Ethan sat alone near the front window with Ghost lying beside the door. Then Ghost exploded upward. The shepherd barked violently and rushed toward the back of the cabin. Ethan was already moving before thought caught up. Outside, near the greenhouse, a shadow moved fast between the snow-covered structures. "Hey!" The figure immediately ran. Ghost launched through the back door like a missile. "Ghost, wait!" Too late. The shepherd vanished into the storm, chasing the intruder across the valley. Ethan grabbed his coat and flashlight and sprinted outside into the blizzard. Snow slashed across his face while darkness swallowed the valley almost completely. Ghost's barking echoed somewhere ahead near the tree line. Then suddenly, silence. Complete silence. Ethan stopped breathing for one terrible second. "Ghost!" Only wind answered, and deep in the frozen darkness beyond the greenhouses, something moved between the trees. Ethan Mercer ran toward it without thinking. Snow exploded beneath his boots, while freezing wind tore through the valley, hard enough to steal his breath. His flashlight beam bounced wildly across buried flower beds and broken greenhouse frames as he sprinted after the movement, disappearing toward the forest. "Ghost!" Nothing. The storm swallowed his voice almost immediately. Behind him, the cabin lights glowed faintly through blowing snow, while the black mountains surrounding the valley vanished into darkness. The old military instincts Ethan spent years trying to bury returned all at once, heart accelerating, vision narrowing, every sound sharpening into threat. He crossed the greenhouse line and entered the trees. The forest changed everything instantly. Wind vanished beneath the dense pines, replaced by heavy silence broken only by snow falling from branches overhead. Ethan slowed slightly now, scanning carefully between the trunks, while his flashlight cut pale tunnels through the storm-dark woods. Then he saw tracks. Fresh. Human. deep boot prints cutting north through the snow. Beside them, Ghost's paw prints. Ethan dropped into a crouch automatically. Years of combat tracking returned before memory could stop it. The intruder had been running fast, slipping occasionally on ice beneath the snow. Ghost's tracks stayed close behind. Then Ethan noticed something else. Blood. Just a few dark drops against the snow. Human or dog? He couldn't tell. His chest tightened violently. Ghost! Still nothing. The silence felt wrong now, too complete. Ethan moved deeper into the forest, following the tracks uphill through thick pine shadows. Snow clung to his beard and jacket, while cold air burned inside his lungs. Branches scraped against him as the trail narrowed toward an old ranger path, almost buried beneath years of neglect. Then suddenly, a sound. Faint. A low bark somewhere ahead. Relief hit Ethan so hard his knees nearly weakened. Ghost! Another bark answered, closer now. Ethan pushed harder uphill through the storm until the forest finally opened near an abandoned ranger bridge spanning a frozen creek below. And there, Ghost stood alone in the snow. The old shepherd's body remained low and tense, facing the darkness beneath the bridge. Snow covered his coat while blood stained part of his shoulder. Ethan's heart nearly stopped. Ghost. The shepherd turned immediately at Ethan's voice. Relief flashed across the dog's face before he limped toward Ethan through the snow. Ethan dropped to his knees beside him instantly. Easy, easy. His hands moved carefully through Ghost's fur until he found the wound. A grazing gunshot. Not deep, but fresh. Rage exploded hot through Ethan's chest. Someone had shot his dog. Ghost whined softly, but stayed standing, still trying to pull Ethan toward the bridge. You tracked him all the way out here, Ethan muttered. Ghost barked once and turned back toward the frozen creek. Then Ethan saw it, a black backpack partially hidden beneath the bridge supports. Ghost limped toward it protectively. The intruder must have dropped it while fleeing. Ethan grabbed the bag quickly and scanned the forest again. Nothing moved now except falling snow. Whoever had broken into the sanctuary was gone. Ghost suddenly stumbled slightly. Ethan caught him immediately. Okay, we're done here. The old shepherd leaned heavily against him for the first time in years. Not weakness, trust. Ethan removed his coat and wrapped it partially around Ghost's injured shoulder before lifting the backpack with his free hand. The hike back down the mountain felt endless. The storm worsened again as midnight deepened across the valley. Ethan half-carried Ghost through the snow while old memories kept clawing their way into his mind. Afghanistan. Night patrols. Blood on snow-covered rock. The sound of helicopters too far away. His breathing began shortening, his chest tightening. Panic crept upward before he could stop it. Ghost noticed immediately. Even injured, the old shepherd pressed against Ethan's leg harder while they moved through the darkness, grounding him, keeping him present, the same way he always had. By the time the cabin lights appeared through the storm again, Ethan's hands were trembling badly. Leah burst through the front door before he even reached the porch. "Oh my God!" She immediately dropped beside Ghost inside the doorway. Ethan shut the door hard behind them, while snow and freezing wind roared outside. The cabin suddenly felt painfully warm. Safe. Leah carefully examined Ghost's wound beside the fireplace while Ethan stood nearby trying to steady his breathing. "It's superficial," Leah said after several tense moments. "The bullet barely grazed him." Relief hit Ethan hard enough to make him dizzy. Ghost lay quietly beside the fire, while Leah cleaned the wound carefully. The shepherd never once snapped or pulled away despite obvious pain. His eyes remained locked on Ethan the entire time, watching him, checking him. Ethan finally lowered himself heavily into the chair beside the fireplace. The adrenaline crash hit all at once. His hands shook uncontrollably now. Leah noticed immediately. "Ethan." He looked away. Too late. She had already seen it. The panic, the flashback, the war still living beneath his skin. Leah's voice softened. You don't have to fight every memory alone anymore. Ethan laughed once quietly. Not humor, exhaustion. That's the problem, he muttered. I don't know how to do anything else. The fire crackled softly between them. Ghost slowly rested his head across Ethan's boot. The old shepherd's eyes finally began relaxing now that Ethan sat still beside him. Leah finished bandaging the wound carefully before leaning back against the couch. He protected something out there, she said quietly. Ethan looked toward the black backpack sitting near the kitchen table. Snow still melted from it onto the wooden floor. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Ethan stood. Ghost immediately tried to rise too. No. Ethan pointed gently toward the rug. Stay. The shepherd reluctantly settled again, but kept watching closely. Ethan carried the backpack to the table and slowly unzipped it. Inside were folders, research files, several of Claire's journals, and a videotape sealed carefully inside a waterproof bag. Ethan froze when he saw the label written across the tape in Claire's handwriting. For Ethan, if they come early. The cabin fell silent. Even Leah stopped breathing for a second. Ethan picked up the tape slowly. Cold realization spread through his chest. Claire knew. She had known people would eventually come after this place, after her research, after whatever she had built here. Leah looked pale now. She never told me about this. Ethan stared at the label. The careful shape of Claire's handwriting nearly broke him all over again. Ghost let out a low sound near the fireplace. Not fear. Recognition. The old shepherd already knew this tape existed. Ethan looked toward him slowly. You've been guarding all of this for years, haven't you? Ghost's tail moved weakly once against the rug. The answer chilled him. Outside, the storm hammered violently against the cabin walls, while darkness swallowed the valley completely. Somewhere beyond the mountains, powerful men were already searching for Claire's work. And now Ethan understood something terrifying. This wasn't over. Claire's death had only started it. Leah crossed her arms tightly. You need to watch that tape. Ethan nodded slowly, but his eyes remained fixed on Ghost. The old dog lay injured beside the fire, exhausted after chasing a gunman through the mountains to protect Claire's secrets. Not because he was trained to, because somewhere along the way, the sanctuary had become his mission too. Ethan walked slowly back toward the fireplace and lowered himself beside Ghost on the rug. For several long seconds, he simply rested one hand against the shepherd's neck, feeling the steady warmth of him still alive beneath his fingers. The fear of losing Ghost had shaken something loose inside him. Not just panic, need. The realization that this dog was the last living creature who fully understood what Claire had built here, and maybe the only one who understood Ethan too. The firelight flickered softly across the cabin walls, while snow buried the valley deeper beneath darkness. Finally, Ethan reached for the videotape again. Claire's final message waited inside it, and somehow, he already knew his life would never look the same after hearing her voice again. The storm raged outside the cabin. Wind slammed against the walls hard enough to rattle the windows, while snow buried the Mercer sanctuary deeper beneath darkness. The mountains surrounding the valley had disappeared completely now, swallowed by midnight and ice. Inside, the cabin glowed with firelight and silence. Ghost rested beside the fireplace beneath thick blankets Leah had wrapped around him after treating the gunshot wound. The old shepherd remained exhausted but alert, his amber eyes tracking Ethan's every movement across the room. Ethan stood beside the old television set Claire kept near the bookshelves. The videotape trembled slightly in his hands. Leah watched quietly from the couch. Neither of them spoke. The cabin itself almost seemed to hold its breath. Finally, Ethan slid the tape into the player. Static hissed softly across the screen. Then the image appeared. Claire. Alive. The sight hit Ethan harder than any battlefield memory ever had. She sat at the kitchen table inside the very same cabin, sunlight spilling warmly through the windows behind her. Her dark hair had grown shorter than Ethan remembered near the end, and exhaustion softened the edges of her face. But her eyes remained exactly the same, kind, steady, still full of love. For several long seconds, Claire simply looked into the camera silently, as if trying to gather strength before speaking. Then she smiled softly. "Hey, cowboy?" Ethan's knees nearly gave out. That was what she used to call him before the war changed him. Ghost lifted his head immediately at the sound of her voice. The old shepherd stared at the television screen without blinking. Claire exhaled slowly. "If you're watching this, then things happened faster than I hoped." The smile faded gently from her face. "And if Ghost brought you here?" Her eyes lowered briefly before lifting again. "Then it means you're still fighting to stay alive." Ethan sat down heavily beside the fireplace. His chest felt tight enough to crack open. Claire continued quietly. "I know you probably feel angry with me right now. Maybe hurt too. You have every right." She glanced out the cabin window for a moment. "But I need you to understand something before anything else." The fire crackled softly beneath the television's glow. This place was never supposed to become a business. Leah lowered her eyes silently. Claire leaned slightly closer toward the camera. "It started because of you." Ethan stopped breathing for a second. Claire's voice softened further. "After your third deployment, I watched pieces of you disappear every year. Not all at once. Slowly. Quietly." Her eyes glistened faintly now. "You stopped sleeping. Stopped laughing. Some days you barely spoke at all." Ethan looked away from the screen briefly. The memories came fast now. Sitting alone in dark rooms at 3 a.m, jumping at fireworks, punching holes through garage walls after nightmares. Claire waiting silently beside him through all of it. "I tried everything I knew," Claire continued. "Doctors, therapists, medication. But nothing reached the parts of you still trapped over there." Ghost slowly crossed the floor and rested against Ethan's side. The old dog seemed drawn toward Claire's voice itself. Then Claire smiled faintly again. "Ghost noticed before I did." Ethan looked back at the screen immediately. Claire glanced downward as if remembering something painful and beautiful at the same time. "The night you woke up screaming after that mission in Kandahar," she whispered. "Ghost climbed into bed beside you and refused to leave your side until morning." Her smile trembled slightly. "That was the first full night you slept in months." Ethan swallowed hard. He remembered. Fragments, anyway. Darkness. Sweat. Ghost pressed against his chest, keeping him anchored to reality. Claire nodded slowly to herself. "That's when I realized healing doesn't always begin with medicine." She looked around the cabin behind her. "Sometimes it begins with feeling safe enough to breathe again." The room fell silent except for the storm outside. Claire continued. "I started bringing veterans here because they understood the silence too. The hypervigilance, the guilt." She looked directly into the camera now, the feeling that part of them never made it home. Leah quietly wiped tears from her face beside the fireplace. Claire reached towards something off-screen and lifted a small flower pot into view. Bright blue mountain flowers bloomed inside it. "These are alpine gentians," she explained softly. "They only grow in very specific conditions. Too much heat kills them. Too much cold kills them." Her fingers brushed gently across the petals. "But when they're protected properly, they survive storms most people think should destroy them." Ethan stared at her silently. Claire smiled sadly. "That's you, Ethan." The words shattered something inside him. Not because they sounded poetic, because they sounded true. Claire lowered the flowers carefully. "I know you think the war broke you." Her voice grew steadier now. "But broken things don't spend years protecting everyone around them." Ethan covered his mouth briefly with one hand. Ghost leaned harder against him. Claire's eyes softened further. "You spent so much time trying to carry your pain alone that you forgot something important." A small tear finally escaped down her cheek. "You were never supposed to survive life by yourself." The storm hammered violently against the cabin windows. Outside, darkness buried the valley completely beneath snow and wind. Inside, Ethan felt years of emotional walls beginning to crack apart. Claire inhaled slowly before continuing. "There's something else you need to know." Her expression changed now, more serious, more urgent. "I wasn't hiding this sanctuary because I was ashamed of it." She glanced toward the window again. "I hid it because people started paying attention." Leah straightened immediately beside the couch. Claire continued carefully. "The compounds we developed here actually work, Ethan. Not miracles, not cures, but enough to help people without destroying them the way opioids do." She leaned forward slightly. "Companies started offering money before clinical testing even finished." Her jaw tightened faintly. "And when I refused, they stopped asking politely." Ethan's eyes narrowed immediately. Claire reached off screen again and lifted several folders toward the camera. "I copied everything important and stored it beneath the greenhouse foundation. If someone tries taking the research before you understand what this place really is," her voice softened again, "protect the people first, not the formulas." Ghost suddenly let out a quiet sound beside Ethan. Recognition. Claire smiled faintly at the dog through the screen. "And Ghost already knows where everything is hidden." Leah shook her head softly in disbelief. Claire looked back into the camera one final time. By now, tears openly filled her eyes. "I wish I'd had more time." The words nearly broke Ethan completely. Claire wiped at her face quietly. "But if you're watching this, then I need you to hear me clearly." Her voice steadied with visible effort. "You are not the man trauma convinced you to become." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Claire continued. "You are still capable of peace." Her lips trembled faintly. "And whether you believe it or not, there are still people who need you here." Silence. Only wind and firelight. Then Claire smiled one final time. The same smile she wore before hospitals and funerals, and all the years pain hollowed them both out. "Take care of Ghost for me," she whispered. Her eyes softened completely. "And Ethan." He looked up immediately. "I never stopped seeing the man I fell in love with." The screen went black. Static filled the cabin softly. Nobody moved. The storm continued roaring outside the valley while firelight flickered across the walls Claire built with her own hands. Ethan sat frozen beside the fireplace, his breathing uneven now. Ghost slowly pushed his head beneath Ethan's trembling hand. And finally, the grief Ethan spent years burying beneath anger and silence tore loose all at once. He bent forward sharply, one hand gripping Ghost's fur, while tears finally broke free without restraint. Not quiet tears, not controlled, the kind pulled from somewhere deep enough to hurt physically. Leah remained silent nearby, giving him the dignity of falling apart. Ghost stayed pressed firmly against Ethan through all of it. The old shepherd didn't move, didn't flinch, just stayed there the same way he had during every nightmare overseas and every sleepless night afterward, holding the line beside him. Eventually, Ethan lifted his head again. His eyes burned red from grief and exhaustion. But something had changed. Not healed, not fixed, focused. Claire hadn't built the sanctuary to make money. She built it because she knew he would eventually lose her, and she refused to let him disappear afterward. Ethan looked toward the dark window beside the fireplace. Beyond the glass, the hidden valley lay buried beneath snow and darkness. But for the first time since Claire died, he no longer felt completely lost inside it. Ghost rested his head across Ethan's knee again. The old dog's breathing had finally slowed peacefully. Ethan stared down at him quietly. "You knew all along," he whispered. Ghost's tail moved once against the floorboards, and somewhere deep inside the storm surrounding the Mercer sanctuary, Ethan finally understood the truth Claire had spent years trying to show him. This place wasn't built to hide from the world. It was built to bring broken people back into it. Morning arrived quietly over the Bitterroot Valley. The storm had finally passed during the night, leaving the mountains buried beneath fresh snow that glittered pale gold beneath the rising sun. Smoke drifted slowly from the cabin chimney, while long shadows stretched across the frozen flower fields surrounding the Mercer sanctuary. For the first time in days, the valley felt still. Not empty, peaceful. Ethan Mercer stood outside the cabin porch with a steaming mug of coffee warming his hands. Cold air rolled through the valley carrying the scent of pine, cedar smoke, and frozen earth. Somewhere near the river below, ice cracked softly beneath moving water. Ghost sat beside him wrapped partially in one of Claire's old wool blankets. The bandage around the shepherd's shoulder stood out sharply against his dark fur, but the old dog already looked stronger this morning. His ears remained alert while he scanned the valley below with calm watchfulness. Ethan glanced down at him. "You should be resting." Ghost ignored him completely. Leah stepped outside behind them carrying another mug. "You know he's not going to listen to that," she said softly. A faint smile almost touched Ethan's face before fading again. Leah leaned against the porch railing beside him. "How are you holding up?" Ethan stared toward the mountains for several seconds before answering. "I don't know yet." It was the most honest response he could give. Everything inside him still felt rearranged after hearing Claire's voice again. The guilt, the grief, the unbearable realization that she spent years trying to save him while preparing for her own death. But beneath all of it, another feeling had begun growing slowly overnight. Purpose. Small. Fragile. But real. Ghost suddenly lifted his head sharply toward the lower road leading into the valley. Ethan noticed immediately. "What is it?" The shepherd stood carefully, despite the injury. Then came the sound. An engine. Slow and distant beneath the mountains. Leah frowned toward the road. "Nobody's supposed to be coming up here." A battered blue pickup truck finally emerged between the trees below. Snow sprayed beneath its tires while it crawled carefully toward the sanctuary. Unlike Damian Cross's polished SUVs, this truck looked old enough to fall apart climbing the mountain. Ghost's posture changed completely. Not defensive. Excited. The pickup stopped near the greenhouse ruins and a tall man stepped out slowly, using a metal prosthetic leg. Mid-30s. Heavy winter beard. Marine Corps jacket faded nearly white from age. He paused the moment he saw the cabin. Then his eyes drifted toward Ghost. Emotion immediately crossed his face. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered. Ghost barked loudly for the first time since the injury. The man laughed softly, despite tears already forming in his eyes. "Good to see you too, old man." Ethan stared in confusion as the stranger climbed toward the porch through deep snow. The man removed his gloves slowly. "Name's Travis Reed," he said. "Claire called me yesterday morning before—" His voice caught briefly. "Before she passed." Leah stepped forward quietly. "You drove all the way from Idaho?" "Straight through the night." Travis looked around the valley slowly. She told me if anything ever happened to her. He swallowed hard. I should come help protect the sanctuary. Ethan exchanged a glance with Leah. Ghost limped forward immediately and pressed against Travis's leg while the former Marine scratched behind the shepherd's ears. You remember him? Ethan asked. Travis smiled sadly. Ghost sat with me through 6 panic attacks my first week here. He glanced toward Ethan. Claire said he used to do the same thing for you. Ethan looked away quietly. Another vehicle appeared near the lower road, then another. Leah slowly exhaled. By noon, 4 more vehicles had climbed into the valley, and each carried someone Claire had once helped. A former Army medic named Rachel carrying years of exhaustion behind tired eyes. An older firefighter named Ben Holloway, who walked with a permanent back injury after losing his wife in a house fire. A quiet young National Guardsman named Luis battling opioid addiction after combat injuries overseas. One by one they arrived at the sanctuary carrying duffel bags, grief, and stories Ethan had never heard before. And somehow, every single one of them already knew Ghost. The old shepherd moved carefully between them despite his injury, greeting each arrival with soft whines and wagging tail movements Ethan had not seen from him in years. It stunned him. Ghost wasn't simply familiar with these people. He remembered them. Rachel sat beside the fireplace later that afternoon, holding a cup of tea while snow drifted outside the cabin windows. I almost killed myself 3 years ago, she admitted quietly. Nobody interrupted. The room remained warm with firelight and silence. Rachel looked toward Ghost lying nearby. Claire brought me here after rehab failed. Her voice trembled slightly. I didn't speak for 4 straight days. Ghost lifted his head toward her. Rachel smiled faintly through tears. He slept outside my bedroom door every night until I finally started talking again. Ben nodded slowly from the kitchen table. Same thing happened to me. The firefighter stared into the fire. After my wife died, I couldn't be around people anymore. He shook his head quietly. Claire never pushed. She just gave me work to do. His eyes drifted toward the greenhouse outside. And Ghost made sure I actually got out of bed every morning. Ethan listened silently from the edge of the room. Each story hit him harder than the last. Not because Claire had helped them, because she built an entire family of wounded people while he isolated himself only a few hours away. The sanctuary had never been empty. It had been alive all along. As evening settled over the valley, the veterans moved naturally around the cabin together, repairing broken shelves, cleaning storm debris from greenhouse entrances, preparing food in the kitchen, while old country music played softly through Claire's ancient radio. For the first time since arriving, laughter drifted through the sanctuary. Real laughter. Warm. Human. Ethan stood outside near the greenhouse alone, watching snow fall gently through the valley twilight. Ghost limped quietly out beside him. The shepherd sat heavily near Ethan's boots and looked toward the glowing cabin windows. Inside, the veterans moved through the warm light, like people slowly remembering how not to feel alone. Ethan stared at them silently. This is what she built, he murmured. Ghost rested against his leg. Not just research, not medicine. People. A place where broken lives could still exist without shame. The cabin door suddenly opened behind them. Leah stepped onto the porch, holding one of Claire's journals. You should probably see this. Ethan followed her back inside. The room quieted slightly as he entered. Leah handed him the journal, carefully already opened to a bookmarked page. Ethan recognized Claire's handwriting immediately. November 14th. Today, Ethan smiled at one of Ghost's stupid tricks for the first time in months. He doesn't realize it yet, but the man I married is still in there somewhere. I think this sanctuary may eventually save him too. Ethan stopped reading. The room blurred slightly. Leah lowered her voice. She never gave up on you. Silence filled the cabin. Then Travis stood slowly near the fireplace. She didn't give up on any of us. One by one, the others nodded quietly. Rachel wiped at her eyes. Ben stared into the fire. Luis rested one shaking hand against Ghost's fur, while the old shepherd stayed close beside him. And suddenly Ethan realized something overwhelming. Claire had not built the sanctuary alone. She built a community, a refuge, a second chance for people the world no longer knew how to carry. Outside, snow continued falling softly across the hidden Montana Valley. Inside, warmth and quiet voices filled the cabin Claire left behind. For the first time in years, Ethan no longer felt like a ghost wandering through someone else's life. He felt part of something living, and somewhere deep beneath the grief still tearing through him. Hope began breathing again. For 3 quiet days, the Mercer sanctuary felt alive. The valley slowly emerged from the storm beneath clear winter skies, while sunlight spilled across the frozen flower fields surrounding the cabin. Snow clung to the pine forests rising along the mountain ridges, glowing silver each morning beneath the Montana dawn. The veterans worked from sunrise until darkness, repairing greenhouse frames, clearing fallen branches, stacking firewood beside the cabin. Ghost moved among them constantly, despite the healing wound in his shoulder. The old shepherd seemed lighter now, calmer, as if the return of people to the sanctuary restored something inside him too. Ethan noticed it every day. Ghost no longer paced restlessly through the cabin at night. He slept. Really slept. Usually beside the fireplace while veterans talked quietly around him. And somehow, Ethan had started sleeping too. Not perfectly. The nightmares still came sometimes, but softer now, further away. That frightened him more than the nightmares themselves. One cold afternoon, Ethan stood inside the largest surviving greenhouse helping Travis reinforce broken support beams. Sunlight filtered weakly through cracked glass overhead, while frozen flower beds stretched beneath layers of snow-covered tarp. The greenhouse still carried Claire's presence everywhere. Small handwritten labels attached to planting trays, old gardening gloves hanging from hooks, a faded radio near the corner workbench. Travis tightened a bolt along the beam before glancing toward Ethan. "You know she talked about you constantly out here." Ethan kept working silently. "Not in some saintly way either," Travis continued with a faint grin. "Half the time she was frustrated as hell." That finally pulled a tired smile from Ethan. "Sounds more accurate." Travis nodded. "But she never stopped believing you'd eventually find your way back." Ethan stared down at the wrench in his hands. What if she was wrong? Travis looked toward Ghost lying near the greenhouse entrance. That dog chased a gunman through a blizzard for this place. His eyes shifted back to Ethan. "Seems like Claire wasn't the only one betting on you." The words stayed with Ethan long after they returned to the cabin. That evening, snow began falling again. Not violently this time. Soft. Quiet. The veterans gathered around the long kitchen table while Leah cooked stew from Claire's old recipes. Laughter drifted through the cabin alongside country music humming softly from the radio. For the first time in years, Ethan found himself sitting among people without feeling trapped. Luis told terrible jokes while Rachel argued with Ben about football. Travis carved small wooden animals beside the fireplace while Ghost rested his head across the Marine's prosthetic leg. The sanctuary felt less like a hiding place now, more like home. Then Ghost stood abruptly. Every conversation stopped immediately. The old shepherd's ears lifted sharply toward the darkness outside the cabin. A low growl rolled through his chest. Ethan rose instinctively. "What is it?" Ghost moved toward the front window. Snow drifted heavily across the valley outside, limiting visibility beyond the nearest greenhouse structures. Ethan stepped beside the shepherd and stared into the darkness. Nothing. Then, movement. Fast. A shadow passing between the greenhouse frames. Ghost barked violently. Not warning. Attack. The shepherd slammed against the front door before Ethan even reached it. Ghost! Too late. The old dog exploded into the snow. Ethan grabbed his coat and flashlight while Travis and Ben immediately followed him outside. Cold wind tore through the valley as snow swirled around them beneath the dark mountains overhead. Ghost's barking echoed somewhere near the eastern greenhouse. Then came another sound, glass shattering. Move! Ethan shouted. They sprinted across the snow. Orange light suddenly exploded through the darkness ahead. Fire. One of the greenhouses burst into flames. The blaze climbed through dry wooden beams and old flower racks almost instantly, illuminating the valley in violent flickering light. Jesus Christ, Travis breathed. Ghost lunged through the smoke near the greenhouse entrance. A man dressed in dark winter gear stumbled backward into the snow with a cry of pain as the shepherd hit him hard enough to knock him sideways. Another masked figure appeared behind the greenhouse and ran toward the tree line. Ethan's military instincts took over instantly. Ben, get water pumps running, he shouted. Travis, with me! The fire roared higher as frozen glass exploded outward from the heat. Ghost pinned the first intruder into the snow, teeth bared dangerously near the man's throat, while the masked figure struggled beneath him. Ethan reached them seconds later. The man's eyes widened in terror, seeing Ethan approach through the firelight. Who sent you? The intruder said nothing. Ghost growled harder. Then another crash echoed behind them. The second greenhouse roof partially collapsed inward beneath flames. Rachel and Luis appeared dragging hoses through deep snow, while Leah shouted instructions from the porch. The entire valley had transformed into chaos. Firelight reflected off falling snow, while smoke billowed upward into the black Montana sky. The trapped intruder suddenly drove one elbow hard into Ghost's injured shoulder. The shepherd yelped sharply. Rage exploded through Ethan. He grabbed the man by the jacket and slammed him against the frozen ground. Who sent you? The intruder panicked now. We were just supposed to scare you! Ethan froze. Ghost remained crouched beside them, growling low through the smoke. The man's breathing shook violently. Cross doesn't want the research getting out. The words landed like gasoline. Damien Cross. Travis cursed beside the fire. The intruder suddenly twisted free and sprinted toward the forest before Ethan could stop him. Ghost tried to chase but stumbled slightly from the injured shoulder. Leave him, Ethan ordered immediately. The shepherd stopped at once. Together, they turned back toward the inferno, consuming the greenhouse. Flames devoured years of Claire's work. Flower beds, research stations, drying racks. The heat rolled across the valley hard enough to melt snow several feet around the structure. And still the veterans fought it. Bucket chains, water hoses, shovels. Nobody ran. Nobody quit. Not even Luis, whose shaking hands barely held steady beneath the freezing water spray. Ethan grabbed another hose line and charged into the smoke beside Travis. For nearly an hour they battled the blaze beneath falling snow and collapsing beams. Finally, the fire weakened, then slowly died. Silence returned to the valley, except for crackling embers and exhausted breathing. The eastern greenhouse stood blackened and partially destroyed beneath rising smoke. Ghost limped quietly through the snow, checking each veteran one by one, making sure everyone remained safe. The old shepherd finally stopped beside Ethan. Soot darkened Ghost's fur, while melted snow dripped from his coat. Ethan knelt immediately beside him. You okay? Ghost pressed his head against Ethan's chest once, alive, still guarding. Leah approached through the smoke carrying a metal lockbox covered in ash. We found this buried beneath one of the work tables. Ethan opened it carefully. Inside sat legal documents, property deeds, trust agreements. Claire's signature filled every page. Leah read quietly over his shoulder, then stopped cold. Oh my God. What? Leah looked up slowly. She transferred ownership months ago. Ethan frowned. To who? Leah stared at the document in disbelief. The Mercer Veteran Sanctuary Trust. Silence settled heavily around them. Travis stepped closer. Meaning what? Leah exhaled slowly. It means nobody can buy the property anymore. Her eyes widened further as she kept reading. Not legally. The land's permanently protected under federal veteran rehabilitation status. Ethan stared at the burning remains of the greenhouse. Claire knew. She had anticipated everything. The offers, the threats, even this attack. Ghost sat quietly beside him while snow drifted softly through the rising smoke around them. The sanctuary still stood, damaged, wounded, but standing. And for the first time since Damian Cross arrived, Ethan understood something clearly. This wasn't about money anymore. This was war. Not the kind fought overseas. The quieter kind fought over control, over greed, over whether broken people still deserved places built for healing instead of profit. Ethan looked toward the surviving greenhouses glowing faintly beneath snow and firelight, then toward the veterans standing together in exhausted silence. Claire had built something powerful enough for men to burn, which meant she had also built something worth protecting. Ghost leaned gently against Ethan's side while the mountains watched silently over the burning valley. And beneath the smoke and snow, Ethan finally made a decision. He was not leaving the sanctuary. Not now, not ever. The words settled inside Ethan Mercer with the weight of something permanent. Snow drifted quietly through the valley as dawn rose over the burned greenhouse ruins. Smoke still curled faintly from the blackened beams, while the surrounding flower fields glowed pale beneath fresh winter light. The sanctuary had survived the attack. Barely. But it had survived. Ethan stood outside alone near the frozen riverbank, watching sunlight slowly spill across the mountains. The cold air bit sharply against his face while exhaustion settled deep into his muscles. Behind him, the Mercer sanctuary was already waking. He could hear movement near the cabin, hammering, voices, veterans rebuilding. Claire would have loved that. Ghost approached slowly through the snow and sat beside Ethan without making a sound. The old shepherd looked tired this morning, older. The fire and gunshot wound had clearly drained him, though he still carried himself with steady discipline. Ethan crouched beside him carefully. You saved everybody again, didn't you? Ghost's ears twitched slightly. Ethan rested one hand gently against the shepherd's neck. For several long seconds, they simply sat together facing the valley below. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt shared. Behind them, the cabin door opened. Leah stepped outside carrying a small wooden box wrapped beneath one of Claire's scarves. You should probably see this too. Ethan stood slowly and followed her back toward the porch. Inside, warmth and movement filled the cabin. Ben repaired shelving near the kitchen, while Rachel organized salvaged medical files across the table. Travis and Luis carried greenhouse supplies through the hallway, already planning reconstruction before the ashes outside had fully cooled. Nobody talked about leaving. That struck Ethan hardest of all. Leah placed the wooden box carefully on the kitchen table. I found it hidden behind the fireplace stones after the fire, she explained quietly. Claire must have concealed it separately from the main research. Ghost immediately lifted his head. Recognition. Ethan slowly opened the box. Inside rested several glass vials cushioned carefully beneath folded cloth. Clear labels written in Claire's handwriting marked each one. Trial Batch 4. Stabilized formula. And finally, EM Final Compound. Ethan froze. Leah looked toward him carefully. That one was designed specifically for you. The room gradually fell silent. Even the veterans nearby stopped moving. Ethan stared at the vial resting inside the box. The liquid inside carried a faint green tint beneath the morning light. Small, ordinary-looking, yet somehow terrifying. Leah gently unfolded several pages stored beneath the vials. Claire's final medical notes. She adjusted her glasses and began reading quietly. Subject: Ethan Mercer. Her voice softened slightly. Chronic nerve trauma, severe sleep disruption, hypervigilance, PTSD-related pain amplification. Ethan looked away. The words sounded clinical, but every single one was true. Leah continued reading. Traditional opioid treatment ineffective long-term. Increased emotional detachment observed. Botanical stabilization trials show consistent reduction in inflammatory nerve response and panic intensity. Travis leaned against the counter nearby. She built that specifically for him? Leah nodded slowly. For years. Ethan swallowed hard. Ghost stood carefully and limped toward the table. The old shepherd rested his nose gently against Ethan's hand, as if encouraging him forward. Leah lowered the papers. Claire never wanted this used recklessly. Her eyes met Ethan's. But she believed the final formula was finally ready. Silence settled over the cabin again. Outside, wind brushed softly across the valley. Ethan stared at the vial. He hated medication. Always had. Too many VA prescriptions left him numb or disconnected over the years. Pills that dulled everything until he barely recognized himself anymore. But Claire wasn't trying to numb him. She had been trying to bring him back. Rachel stepped quietly toward the table. You don't have to prove anything by suffering forever. The words landed gently. Not judgment. Understanding. Ben nodded slowly nearby. Most of us spent years thinking pain was punishment we deserved. Luis looked toward Ethan from the hallway. Turns out pain doesn't actually care whether you deserve it. A faint, tired laugh moved through the room. Even Ethan smiled slightly. Ghost remained pressed against Ethan's side, waiting. Finally, Ethan picked up the vial. The glass felt cool against his fingers. Leah carefully explained the dosage while Ethan listened silently. Claire's notes remained detailed down to exact timing and environmental factors. Even now, Claire was still taking care of him. The realization nearly hurt more than the grief itself. Leah prepared a small cup of warm tea using herbs from Claire's shelves. Then carefully, Ethan added the formula. Only a few drops. The liquid dissolved almost instantly. Every veteran in the room watched quietly. Not because they expected miracles, because they understood what trust cost someone like Ethan. He stared at the tea for several long seconds, then drank. The taste surprised him. Earthy, sharp, warm. Like the mountains themselves somehow dissolved into liquid. Nothing happened immediately. No dramatic shift. No sudden wave of relief. Just silence. Ethan set the cup down carefully. Well, Ben muttered quietly. That's anticlimactic. Several people smiled faintly. Ghost settled beside Ethan's chair again. The morning passed slowly. The veterans continued working while Ethan helped Travis salvage surviving greenhouse materials from the fire. Snow melted steadily beneath weak sunlight, while smoke still lingered faintly in the frozen air. Hours passed. Then Ethan noticed something strange. His back didn't hurt. Not completely gone, but quieter. The constant burning pressure along his spine, the one he carried for years like rusted metal buried beneath his skin, had softened. He stopped walking near the greenhouse ruins. Confused. Travis noticed immediately. You okay? Ethan rotated one shoulder carefully. Normally, even small movements triggered pain spikes sharp enough to make him brace instinctively. Now, nothing. Not numbness. Absence. The distinction stunned him. Ghost watched from nearby beside the cabin porch, completely calm. The shepherd's usual anxious monitoring behavior had disappeared almost entirely since Ethan took the formula. Like the dog sensed the change before Ethan fully understood it himself. By sunset, another realization hit harder. Ethan wasn't scanning every sound, not constantly. The hypervigilance that kept him trapped inside combat instincts for years had eased enough for silence to feel peaceful instead of threatening. He stood alone outside the cabin watching dusk settle across the valley, while snow reflected pale blue beneath the evening sky. The mountains looked beautiful tonight. Not dangerous. Beautiful. Ghost slowly approached and sat beside him beneath the porch light. For once, the old shepherd didn't stare constantly into the darkness, searching for threats. He simply rested. Ethan crouched beside him. You knew this would work. Ghost's tail moved once against the snow. The sanctuary behind them glowed warmly with firelight and quiet voices. Veterans laughed softly inside while music drifted through the cabin windows. Life. Simple life. Something Ethan thought the war permanently stole from him. Leah stepped quietly onto the porch carrying Claire's journal. She left another note for today. Ethan looked up. Leah handed him the open page. Claire's handwriting stretched carefully across the paper. If the formula works, he'll notice the silence first. Not outside. Inside himself. I pray he remembers peace isn't weakness. It's survival too. Ethan stared at the words while cold evening wind moved gently through the valley. Inside himself. That was exactly it. For years, his mind felt like a battlefield that never fully stopped firing. Tonight. The war inside him had finally gone quiet enough to hear something else beneath it. Hope. Ghost leaned gently against his shoulder while the mountains darkened around the sanctuary, and for the first time since returning from war, Ethan Mercer stood beneath the Montana sky without feeling like he needed to survive it. Winter slowly loosened its grip on the Bitterroot Valley. Over the following weeks, snow began melting along the lower hillsides, while narrow streams cut through the frozen flower fields surrounding the Mercer sanctuary. Sunlight lingered longer each evening, casting golden light across the mountains and waking small hints of green beneath the ice. The sanctuary changed with the season. So did Ethan. The veterans rebuilt the damaged greenhouse together board by board beneath Claire's old construction notes. Rachel transformed one cabin room into a medical office. Ben repaired the water systems. Luis, now 3 weeks sober, spent entire afternoons planting fresh seedlings beside Ghost near the greenhouse windows. And every morning, more people arrived. Some stayed one night. Some stayed longer. A retired police officer struggling with panic attacks. A young widow whose husband never emotionally returned from Afghanistan. An army pilot who hadn't slept through a single night in 4 years. None of them came because of advertisements. They came because someone Claire once helped told them there was a place in the Montana mountains where broken people weren't treated like burdens. And somehow, Ghost always greeted them first. The old shepherd became the quiet heartbeat of the sanctuary. He sat beside veterans during nightmares, walked with them along the river during panic episodes, rested near the porch swing while people shared grief they had buried for years. Ethan watched it happen every day, and slowly, without realizing it, he became part of it too. One cold morning near early spring, Ethan stood beside the greenhouse entrance watching Rachel teach Luis how to transplant alpine flowers into fresh soil trays. Ghost slept peacefully nearby beneath warm sunlight. Peacefully. That still stunned Ethan sometimes. Leah approached carrying a folder beneath her arm. You should probably read this. Ethan frowned slightly as she handed it over. Legal paperwork, corporate acquisition notices, threat assessments, private lobbying filings. The deeper Ethan read, the darker his expression became. "They're escalating," Leah said quietly. "Cross?" She nodded. "He's trying to challenge Claire's trust, legally." Leah crossed her arms against the cold breeze. "And there's pressure coming from investors now, too." Ethan looked toward the mountains. "How much money are we talking about?" Leah hesitated. "Enough to make very dangerous people impatient." Ghost suddenly lifted his head. The old shepherd stood slowly and stared toward the lower road leading into the valley. A familiar sound echoed through the trees. Engines. Black SUVs, again. The atmosphere around the sanctuary shifted immediately. Veterans stopped working. Silence spread across the greenhouse yard while the vehicles climbed slowly toward the cabin through melting snow and muddy spring roads. 3 SUVs this time, not 2. Ghost moved directly beside Ethan, protective, focused. The lead vehicle stopped near the porch. Damian Cross stepped out first, but he wasn't alone. 2 attorneys followed behind him along with another older man wearing a dark wool coat and polished leather gloves. The newcomer carried himself with the calm confidence of someone accustomed to controlling outcomes. Damian removed his sunglasses slowly. "You look healthier," he said casually. Ethan didn't answer. The older attorney stepped forward politely. "Mr. Mercer, my name is Harold Whitaker." He extended a hand Ethan ignored completely. "I represent several financial and medical interests regarding your late wife's research." Ghost growled softly. Whitaker glanced toward the dog but continued smoothly. "We'd prefer this conversation remain civilized." Ben quietly appeared beside the greenhouse behind Ethan. Then Travis, then Rachel. One by one, the sanctuary veterans gathered silently nearby. Not threatening. Present. Damian noticed immediately. "So this is what the sanctuary's become," he muttered. Ethan crossed his arms. "State your business." Whitaker opened a leather folder carefully. "We're prepared to offer $20 million for full acquisition rights to the Mercer Sanctuary, all associated formulas, research materials, and future patents." Silence. Even the wind seemed to pause across the valley. 20 million. Luis actually let out a stunned breath behind Ethan. Whitaker continued calmly. "That amount includes lifetime medical support funding for all veterans currently residing here." Damian stepped forward slightly. "You could help thousands of people with that kind of money, Ethan." The words hit harder than Ethan expected, because part of him immediately wondered if Damian was right. $20 million could rebuild the sanctuary completely, expand treatment programs, fund housing, medical staff, resources Claire never had access to, for one dangerous second. Temptation crept in. Whitaker noticed immediately. "We understand your emotional attachment to the property," he said smoothly. "But sentimentality shouldn't prevent larger humanitarian progress." Leah's expression hardened instantly. "You mean profit?" Whitaker smiled politely. "Those things are not mutually exclusive." Ghost suddenly stepped forward. The old shepherd moved directly in front of the cabin porch stairs and planted himself between Ethan and the corporate visitors, not barking, not lunging, simply refusing them passage. Damian looked down at the dog carefully. "He still doesn't like me." Ethan's eyes drifted toward Ghost. The shepherd never broke eye contact with the men standing before the sanctuary, guarding, holding the line. Then Ethan remembered something. Claire's journal. He turned suddenly and walked back inside the cabin without another word. The others exchanged confused glances outside. Ghost remained exactly where he stood, blocking the porch. Ethan moved quickly through the cabin toward Claire's bedroom. His hands searched through stacked journals until he found the final leather notebook hidden beneath the bedside drawer. The last pages remained unfinished. He opened carefully. Claire's handwriting appeared shakier near the end. If they ever offer Ethan money, I'm afraid part of him will believe taking it could save everyone faster. That's what good soldiers do. They sacrifice the smaller thing to protect the larger mission. Ethan's throat tightened. But healing cannot survive inside greed. Once corporations control this place, suffering becomes business instead of compassion. And people like Ethan, people already carrying invisible wounds, become products instead of human beings. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Claire understood him even here, even now. The final lines nearly broke him completely. If Ethan ever reads this, I hope he remembers something the war tried to erase from him. His humanity is worth more than efficiency. He stared at the page silently, then slowly closed the journal. Outside, the valley waited. So did the decision. Ethan walked back onto the porch, carrying the notebook in one hand. Ghost immediately stepped beside him again. Whitaker adjusted his coat slightly. "Mr. Mercer, shall we continue?" Ethan looked across the sanctuary. Veterans rebuilding greenhouses, fresh flowers beginning to bloom beneath melting snow, ghosts standing guard beneath Claire's wind chimes. This place had already become exactly what Claire intended. Not a corporation, a refuge. He looked directly at Damien. "No." Damien blinked once. "Excuse me? I'm not selling the sanctuary." Whitaker's polite expression tightened slightly. "Mr. Mercer, this amount of funding could dramatically expand treatment access." Ethan nodded slowly. "I know." "Then why refuse?" Ethan glanced down at Claire's journal before answering. "Because Claire already understood something you don't." Whitaker waited. Ethan's voice remained calm. "You think wounded people need managing." His eyes hardened slightly. She believed they needed belonging. Silence spread across the valley. Wind moved softly through the flower fields. Damien's patience finally cracked. "You're making a catastrophic mistake." "No," Ethan replied quietly. "I already made those mistakes." He looked toward the sanctuary behind him. "I'm done repeating them." Whitaker closed the folder sharply. "You realize pressure won't stop after today." Ethan nodded once. "I know." Ghost stood taller beside him. The old shepherd's gaze never left the men near the vehicles. Finally, Damien exhaled sharply in frustration. "You really think this place can survive what's coming?" Ethan looked across the valley one final time before answering. For the first time since Claire died, his voice carried certainty instead of grief. "It already survived worse." Damien stared at him for several long seconds, then turned away. The attorneys followed silently while the SUVs prepared to leave. Before climbing into the vehicle, Damien looked back once toward Ghost. The old shepherd still blocked the porch steps, guarding the sanctuary exactly the way Claire knew he would. The engines roared, then the vehicles disappeared down the mountain road. Silence returned slowly. The veterans remained standing quietly around Ethan. No cheering, no celebration, just understanding. Rachel stepped forward first. "You sure about this?" Ethan looked toward the greenhouse where fresh flowers now pushed through thawing soil, then toward Ghost. The old dog finally relaxed and sat heavily beside the porch. Ethan smiled faintly. "Yeah," he said softly. For the first time in years, he was. Spring arrived quietly in the Bitterroot Mountains. The snow melted slowly from the valley floor, revealing fields of wildflowers stretching around the Mercer sanctuary like patches of color waking beneath the Montana sun. Purple lupines climbed the hillsides. White mountain daisies swayed near the riverbank. Claire's greenhouse glowed green again beneath repaired glass panels reflecting the morning light. Life had returned to the sanctuary, and people kept coming. Veterans, families, widows, men and women carrying invisible wounds they no longer knew how to hide from the world. Some arrived angry, some ashamed, some exhausted enough to barely speak. But little by little, the valley worked on them. The mountains, the quiet, the gardens, the long evenings beside the fire, and always, Ghost. The old German shepherd became the first thing most visitors noticed. Not because he barked, not because he demanded attention, because he understood. He sat beside veterans during sleepless nights, walked slowly beside trembling hands during panic attacks, rested beside lonely people until silence no longer felt dangerous. Some nights Ethan would wake before dawn and find Ghost lying beside a new arrival, sitting quietly on the porch, staring out toward the flower fields. Never trained for therapy, never taught compassion. Yet somehow, the old shepherd carried both better than most people ever could. The sanctuary changed Ethan, too. Not all at once. Healing never happened that way. But slowly, the war inside him loosened its grip. The nightmares came less often. His hands no longer shook every time a car backfired in town. Some mornings he woke without immediately searching for danger. And when pain returned, Claire's formula softened it enough for him to breathe through the worst days instead of drowning beneath them. One warm afternoon in late spring, Ethan stood near the greenhouse entrance helping Luis install fresh irrigation lines while laughter drifted across the valley. Rachel worked beside several new arrivals planting herbs near the river. Ben repaired porch railings while country music echoed softly from the cabin windows. For the first time since Claire's funeral, the sanctuary no longer felt like grief. It felt alive. Ghost rested nearby beneath a patch of sunlight, older now, slower in his movements after the winter injury. But peaceful. That mattered most. Ethan glanced toward him occasionally while working, always checking, always grateful, because somewhere deep inside himself, Ethan knew something he rarely admitted out loud. He would not have survived Claire's death without that dog. Late that evening, Ethan drove into Alder Ridge for supplies. The small mountain town looked different now, less distant. Children rode bicycles near the grocery store, while sunlight faded softly behind the mountains surrounding town. People recognized Ethan now when he walked through the streets, not as the broken veteran who barely spoke, as the man rebuilding Claire's sanctuary. Several townspeople even donated tools and lumber after hearing what happened during the fire. Community had found them too. Ethan loaded the final supply boxes into his truck just before sunset. Then he noticed something strange. Ghost refused to climb inside. The shepherd stood near the passenger door, staring back toward the mountains instead. Ethan smiled faintly. "Come on, old man." Ghost didn't move. Instead, he turned slowly toward the road leading back to the sanctuary. Waiting. Ethan frowned slightly. "You seriously walking me home now?" Ghost's tail moved once. Then the old dog began trotting slowly toward the mountain road. Ethan laughed quietly beneath his breath and climbed into the truck. The drive back through the Bitterroot Mountains felt peaceful beneath the fading evening sky. Golden light spilled across the forests, while spring wind carried the scent of pine and blooming flowers through the open windows. Ghost ran ahead beside the road part of the way, like he already knew exactly where he belonged. By the time Ethan reached the sanctuary, sunset had painted the valley gold. Veterans gathered near the greenhouse fire pit, laughing softly, while music drifted through the warm evening air. Lanterns glowed beside the pathways Claire once built through the flower fields. The entire sanctuary looked alive beneath the mountains. Ethan parked the truck and stepped out slowly. Ghost immediately walked past him, not toward the greenhouse, not toward the veterans, toward the cabin porch. The old shepherd climbed the wooden steps carefully and settled beside Claire's wind chimes near the rocking chair she used to sit in during summer evenings. Then he stopped moving completely, watching the valley below. The flowers, the people, the life continuing beneath the Montana sunset. Ethan carried the supply boxes halfway toward the porch before finally noticing. Ghost? The old shepherd didn't respond, not ignoring him, just staying exactly where he wanted to be. Ethan slowly set the boxes down. The realization came quietly, like so many important things finally had. Ghost was not guarding the cabin because of training, not because Claire told him to, not because of the research. He was guarding what the sanctuary became, the life Claire left behind, the future she built for Ethan long before he believed he deserved one. Ethan climbed the porch slowly and lowered himself beside the old dog. The wooden boards creaked softly beneath them, while evening wind moved gently through the valley flowers below. Ghost rested against Ethan's side, tired, content, at peace. Ethan looked out across the sanctuary. Rachel laughed near the greenhouse while Luis chased one of the sanctuary dogs through the grass. Ben sat near the fire pit, teaching a young veteran how to carve fishing lures from pine wood. Broken people, healing together, exactly the way Claire dreamed. The wind chimes above the porch stirred softly. For a moment, Ethan could almost imagine Claire sitting beside them again, watching the valley glow beneath sunset. Not gone. Still here somehow. In the flowers. In the people. In Ghost. Ethan rested one hand gently against the shepherd's gray-flecked fur. "You did it, buddy," he whispered. Ghost's tail moved slowly once against the porch boards. Below them, warm light began glowing through the greenhouse windows as darkness settled gently across the mountains. The sanctuary breathed with quiet life, and for the first time since the funeral beneath frozen pines, Ethan no longer felt abandoned by the world. He felt needed. The realization settled deeply inside him while the Montana sky darkened overhead. Not every wound disappeared. Not every memory faded. Some pain stayed. But pain was no longer the only thing left. Beside him, Ghost watched over the sanctuary one final time beneath Claire's wind chimes. Calm. Steady. Home. And deep in the Bitterroot Mountains, a hidden flower cabin once buried beneath grief had become something far greater than money ever could buy. It became a place where wounded souls remembered they were still worth saving. If you believe some things in life are worth protecting no matter the price, type "stand" down in the comments. And if someone in your family has ever carried invisible scars from war, loss, or hard times, let us know where you're watching from tonight. Subscribe to the channel for more stories about loyalty, second chances, and the people who refuse to give up when life tries to break them.